silver chain snapped around a woman's wrist. Two guards yanked her forward across the marble floor. Her knees hit the stone with a sound that echoed through the throne hall. Blood ran from a cut above her eye and pooled in the hollow of her collarbone. She did not cry out. She did not beg. She lifted her chin and looked straight at the young man on the iron throne. The bond mark on her wrist was glowing. Not a soft glow. A hard, white gold glow that lit the dim hall like a struck match. Every wolf in the room saw it. Every wolf in the room went still. The Alpha King they called Chaol of Ironcrest stood up so fast his crown almost tipped. 42 years old, exiled for 24 of them, and her name was Leora. And the question every general was screaming in his head was the same. How is the king's fated mate a banished Omega twice his age? Stay with me on this one. Because what she whispered next broke the pack in half. The hall they call Ironcrest is carved out of one black mountain. The throne is a single iron chair welded by the first king 300 winters ago. The floor is polished pale stone shot through with veins of silver. Silver hurts wolves. That is the point. Every visitor walks in remembering the floor can bite them if the king decides it should. Leora had walked that floor exactly once before. 24 years ago. Pregnant. 23 winters old. Wearing the white linen of an Omega bound for the moon ceremony. The night they took her son and sent her to the pine forests beyond the eastern ridge, she had walked out of that hall on bare, bleeding feet and sworn she would never set foot on that stone again. Now here she was, dragged, bleeding, hands tied with silver wire that was eating into her skin like a slow fire. Believe me, she had not chosen this. The patrol had found her in the burned grain field 3 nights ago, kneeling over the dying body of a young scout. The boy had taken a poisoned arrow under the collarbone. Leora was an Omega, the lowest rank a wolf can carry, but she was also the best healer the eastern forests had produced in a century. She had cut the arrow out with a piece of glass and packed the wound with crushed silver leaf and her own spit because there was nothing else, and the boy had lived. The boy had been the king's youngest cousin. That was what saved her from being put down on the spot. That was also what doomed her. Because when she touched the boy's neck to check his pulse, the mark on her wrist had woken up. The boy had run home talking about it. The council had sent 12 enforcers after her by sundown. Now here's the thing about the mark. A fated mate bond is not chosen. It is not given. It is not granted by any ceremony or council. It appears on the skin of 2 wolves who share a soul thread, and it appears at the moment the older of the 2 first touches the younger after the younger comes of age. The younger of the 2 had just turned 24. The older had been 42 for 2 seasons. The math was wrong. The bond was wrong. The whole thing was wrong, and every wolf in the throne hall knew it, and yet the mark on her wrist would not stop glowing. The Alpha King stepped down off the dais. 1 step. 2. He stopped halfway to her, and his nostrils flared the way wolves' nostrils flare when they are reading a scent and finding it impossible. His face went from pale to white. The pack regent, a heavy-shouldered older Lycan named Vorin, moved between them. Vorin had run the pack for 22 years while Chaol was a child, and he had a way of standing that made you feel he was the wall and you were the dust. He said one sentence. Kill her now and burn the body before the bond seats. Chaol did not look at him. Chaol was looking at Leora's wrist. And Leora, kneeling on the floor with blood running into her teeth, smiled the smallest smile and said only this. Ask him to step closer. Then I will tell you why the mark is wrong. To understand why she said that, you have to understand the night the old king died. 24 winters passed. A storm pulling the roof off half the longhouses. The old king bleeding out from a silver bolt under his ribs, 3 assassins dead at his feet, and the queen in the birthing chamber screaming her son into the world, while the regent Vorin held the door shut against the enemy still inside the walls. There were 2 births that night. The queen birthed in air at the 3rd hour past midnight. An Omega healer in the side house birthed her own son at the 4th. The Omega's man, a battle-scarred enforcer, had been killed in the courtyard an hour before. Nobody told her. Both newborns were boys. Both were carried to the warm room together, because the queen's chamber was leaking blood and the side house was leaking rain. Voren was the only senior wolf in the warm room for the next 2 hours. Voren and one terrified nursemaid. Leora did not know this then. Nobody did. The next morning, the queen was dead from the bleeding. The old king died at noon from the silver. There were 2 infants in 2 cradles, and one of them was the heir to Ironcrest, and one of them was the orphan son of a dead Omega healer. Voren came out of the warm room carrying one of those infants in his arms, and announced to the council that this was the king's son. He swore it on the Iron Throne. The council bowed. The pack bowed. The infant grew up to be Chaol of Ironcrest, 24th king of his line, raised inside the Black Mountain by tutors and weapon masters, and never once allowed to leave the inner ring of the keep until he was 16. The other infant was placed at his mother's breast 3 days later when she was finally allowed out of her birthbed, and she held him for 61 days, and on the 62nd day the council came and took him for the moon ceremony, and when she walked into the ceremony hall, she was given a different baby. A baby with a different scent. A baby who did not know her. She had screamed. She had clawed 2 guards bloody. She had bitten Voren on the hand, and Voren still carried the scar across his knuckles. The council had ruled her hysterical from the loss of her mate and grief-mad, and they had given her a choice. Be put down quietly, or be exiled to the eastern pine forests, and never speak the word son in pack territory again. She had chosen exile. She had walked out on bare bleeding feet. She had survived in the forest for 24 years on roots and rabbits, and the small coin the woodcutters paid her for healing their children. And every night for 24 years, she had asked the moon the same question. Where is my boy? The moon never answered. But the moon, it turned out, had been keeping track. Because a fated mate bond between mother and son cannot light up. That bond does not exist. There is a different bond, an older bond, a bond the wolves call moonthread, that ties a parent to a stolen child until the child is found. The mark on Leora's wrist was not a mating mark. The mark on Leora's wrist was a moonthread, and it had been sleeping for 24 years, and the moment her hand had touched the neck of the young scout, 3 feet away from where the king's cousin had been standing, 3 feet away from a stone wall that the king himself had passed earlier that morning, the thread had finally caught the scent on the air, and it had woken up. And now it was glowing in the throne hall and pointing straight at the boy on the iron chair. She knew. She had known since the patrol grabbed her in the field. She had known, and she had said nothing because she knew Voren would have her killed before the truth could be spoken. The only place the truth could be spoken and survived was here, in front of the council, with the mark glowing where every wolf could see. So she had let them drag her here. She had let them tie her with silver wire. She had let them throw her on the floor. Because the closer Chaol stepped, the brighter the mark would burn, and the brighter it burned, the harder it became for Voren to silence it. Chaol took another step. Then another. The mark on Leora's wrist flared so bright that the silver wire smoked. He stopped 6 feet from her. His own hand came up and pressed against his sternum, the way a man presses against a bruise. He had felt something the moment she was dragged through the door. A pull. A thread. A weight in his chest he had never had a name for. Kings are not raised to know themselves. Kings are raised to know the room. He turned his face toward Voren, and his voice was low. Why is she glowing? Voren said the word again, calmer this time, almost gentle. Kill her, sire. Some Omegas are born with a sickness in their blood that makes the marks light up false. It is a known thing in the old scrolls. We will have the body burned within the hour, and the pack will never speak of this. Leora said, from the floor, with blood in her teeth, the old scrolls have no such sickness in them, and Voren knows it because Voren wrote that part of the scrolls himself 19 years ago, after I was already exiled, so that no other Omega could ever stand in front of a throne and prove what I am about to prove. The whole hall went still. Chaol said, prove what? Leora said, "Ask the regent for the scar on his right hand. Ask him how he got it. Then ask the council to bring the birthstone from the moon altar. Then look at me, your majesty, and ask yourself why it is that you have never been able to stand the sound of crying women, even though you have lived all your life inside a fortress where you have heard almost none." Voron's hand twitched toward the dagger at his belt. 3 of the king's personal guard moved between Voron and Leora without being ordered. They had seen the mark. They were old enough to remember a night 24 years ago. They were not going to let her be killed in front of them before she finished her sentence. Kale said, "Bring the birthstone." Voron said, "Sire, this is madness," and Kale said, "Bring the birthstone," in a voice that he had never used before, a voice that came up out of his chest from somewhere lower than his lungs. The council master ran. The hall waited. Leora knelt on the cold stone, the silver wire eating her wrists, and she let herself breathe for the first time in 24 years. She had walked out of this hall once on bare bleeding feet. She had come back in chains. And the boy she had been forbidden to ever speak of was standing 6 feet away with his hand on his chest and his eyes on her face. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. Tell me you want the rest of these. It tells me to keep telling them. The birthstone was a flat black disc the size of a dinner plate, carved out of a meteorite the first king had pulled from a crater on the night of his coronation, and ringed with 60 small hollows. Each hollow held 1 drop of dried blood. Every infant born to the royal line had a drop pressed into the stone at the moon ceremony, the 62nd day after birth, and the stone would warm if the blood matched the line. If the stone stayed cold, the child was not of the blood. The stone had not failed in 300 years. The council master came back into the hall carrying it on a folded cloth like a man carrying a sleeping infant. Voron's face had gone the color of old paper. Kale had not moved. Leora had not moved. The council master set the stone down on the marble in front of the throne and stepped back. The hall watched. The stone sat there, black and dead and cold. Kale said, "Regent, come forward and place your hand on the stone." Voron did not move. Kale said it again, and this time the guards moved, and Voron walked stiffly to the stone and pressed his palm against it. The stone stayed black. The stone stayed cold. Voron was not of the blood. Nobody had ever asked him to touch the stone. Nobody had had reason. Kale said, "My turn." He stepped down off the dais. The whole council made a small sound, like a held breath letting go. He knelt on one knee beside the stone. He placed his right palm flat against the black disc. He waited. He waited longer. He waited a third time. The stone stayed black. The stone stayed cold. The hall made no sound at all. Kale lifted his hand and looked at his own palm as if he had never seen it before. He looked at Leora. Leora looked back. Her eyes were dry now. She said gently, "The way you say a thing to a frightened animal, ask me my full name, your majesty. Ask me the name I was given when I was born." He said it. She said, "Leora of the Silverleaf line, daughter of the healer who served your grandfather, and mother of the son who was taken from her arms at the moon ceremony of the 20th winter of the old king's reign. The mother of the boy that man over there put in the king's cradle the morning the old king died. The mother of the boy who is not the king." And then she said the line that the whole pack would repeat for 100 years after that day. She said it quiet. She said it almost as a kindness. She said, "I am not your mate. I am your mother." The sound the hall made was not a roar. It was a sigh. The sigh of a 1,000-year-old building finally settling. Kale's hands went down to the stone, and he picked it up and stood with it cradled against his chest, and he looked at the man who had raised him, and his face was a thing Leora would remember for the rest of her life. He said, "Who was the boy in the cradle?" Voron said nothing. Kale said, "Look at me, Regent, who was the boy?" Voron's mouth opened and closed. The guards moved closer. Leora said gently, "Your son." The boy in the cradle was the regent's son, born the same night to the regent's sister in the side chamber. The regent's sister had died in childbirth, and her boy had been laid in the warm room beside ours and yours and the queen's. He took his sister's son and put him on the throne, and he took my son and gave him to a wet nurse, and sold the wet nurse into the eastern forests 2 winters later so no living wolf would ever testify. Believe me, I tracked her for 11 years. I found her grave under a pine tree. She is the reason I stayed in the forest. Vorin said this proves nothing. The stone could be wrong. The line of testing is corrupted, and Kale said, Regent, the stone has never been wrong. Bring me the woman's son. Bring me the boy you raised as the king. Find him. Now. The chamberlain bowed and ran. The hall waited again. Kale set the birthstone down on the floor very carefully. He walked the 6 feet across the marble. He knelt down on the stone in front of his mother. He took her tied hands in his, and the silver wire burned his palms because silver burns kings too. He did not flinch. He cut the wire with a single sharp tool from his own belt, and the wire fell off her wrists in 2 pieces. Her wrists were raw. The mark was still glowing. He looked at her face, and he said the word almost as a question, almost as a prayer. He said, Mother. She said yes. She had imagined that word for 24 years. She had not cried in 24 years. She did not cry now. Her body was too tired to cry. She let her forehead come down to rest against his, and the mark on her wrist faded slowly, like a candle going out, because moon threads dim once the lost child is found. The chamberlain came back into the hall 10 minutes later. With him was a tall, pale, fine-boned young man, wearing the practice clothes of a sword-yard. He was 24 years old. He had eyes the color of beaten copper, the color of Vorin's sister's eyes in the old portraits. He did not look anything like Kale. He did not look anything like the old king. He had been told only that the king wanted to see him, urgently. He walked into the throne hall and saw Leora kneeling with the king's arms around her shoulders, and he saw Vorin standing alone, surrounded by guards, and he understood faster than anyone expected. He said only one thing. He said, Father. And Vorin closed his eyes. Kale stood up. He helped Leora to stand. Her legs were not strong. He kept one arm around her. He turned to the council and he said, This man over here is not the king. He has been raised as the king, and that is not his fault, and he will not be harmed. He is my brother in the only way the moon understands brotherhood, and the council will treat him as such. The regent will be tried for treason against the throne and against the line. The Omega healer Leora of the Silverleaf line is restored to her rank, her property, and her name. She is the king's mother. She is also, until the council can confirm by the older laws of the pack, the temporary holder of the throne until the question of succession can be properly settled. Nobody in the hall objected. Nobody would have dared. Leora opened her mouth to say no, to refuse, to say she did not want this. She had only ever wanted her son back, and Kale caught her eye and shook his head very slightly. Wait. Not now. We do this properly. She closed her mouth. The pale young man, the one Vorin had raised in lies, walked across the hall and stopped in front of Leora. He said, My lady, I did not know. She said, Child, no one is asking you to have known. He said, What should I call you? She said, Call me by my name. He said, Leora. She said, Yes. He nodded once and stepped back. He did not look at Vorin. He had not been asked to look at Vorin. He understood already that the man who had raised him as a king had used him as a thief uses a coin. Vorin was led out in irons. The pack heard the cell door close in the lower halls of the mountain an hour later. He would never come out. Not alive. Not in the laws that govern Ironcrest. The council took 6 days to confirm the truth by every old law on the books. 6 days during which Leora slept in a chamber 3 doors from the king's, ate at the king's table, sat beside the king at council, and did almost no talking at all. She had spent 24 winters in a one-room hut, talking only to wounded woodcutters and to herself. The throne hall was too loud for her. The wind through the mountain was too loud. The maids were too quick. Kale saw all of it. He sent her plain food and quiet hours. He sent the youngest, smallest maid he could find, a girl of 17 with a soft voice. He asked her, on the 7th morning, what she wanted. He asked it sitting on the floor of her chamber in his linen shirt with his crown across the room on a table, because the crown made her flinch. She told him the truth. She wanted to go home. The pines were her home now. The hut, the small herb garden, the deer that came to the porch in the early dawn. She did not want a throne. She did not want a council. She wanted her son to visit her in the pines whenever the running of the country let him. She wanted to die some winter under those pines, knowing that her boy was alive in this world and knew who she was. That was all. He listened. He nodded. He said, "I will build you a road." She said, "Do not build me a road. Build yourself a horse and ride the old one." He laughed. It was the first time anyone had ever heard the Alpha King of Ironcrest laugh. The maid outside the door said later that the laugh was a young laugh, the laugh of a boy who had been told for the first time in his life that he was allowed to leave the mountain. The council met on the 8th day. The vote was unanimous. Kale of Ironcrest, son of Leora of the Silverleaf line, son also of a dead enforcer from the courtyard of the long-ago Storm Knight, was confirmed by the older laws as the rightful Alpha King. The pale young man who had been raised in his place was given the rank of cousin brother, a real rank in the old laws, and a holding in the southern hills with 200 head of stock and the freedom to keep his own name. The man took the offer with both hands. He has never since claimed any other rank. He visits the king twice a year. They hunt together in the autumn. They are quiet around each other in the way of men who have been forced into a story neither of them asked for, and have decided to make a kind life inside it anyway. The regent was tried on the 9th day. The trial took 1 hour. He admitted everything in the end. He said he had loved his sister and her child more than he had loved the old king. He said when his sister died with the baby in her arms in the side chamber, he had simply not been able to leave the baby behind. He said he had never meant for Leora to lose her son. He said the wet nurse was an accident. He said many things. The council did not need any of them. The sentence was the silver pit. He was lowered into it at sundown. Leora did not watch. She had stopped wanting any wolf to suffer a long time ago. That part of her had stayed in the pines. The council asked her, on the morning before the sentence, if she wanted to speak with Vorin alone. She thought about it for a long time. She walked the upper corridor of the keep, the one that looked east toward the forests, and she stood at the arrow slit and she watched the light move on the trees, and at the end of an hour she went back to the council chamber and said yes. They brought her down to the lower halls. Vorin was sitting on the stone bench in his cell, with his hands on his knees. He had been a heavy man for 30 winters. The week in the cell had not bent him. He stood up when she came in. He did not bow. He did not have the right to bow anymore. He said healer, and his voice was the voice of a man who had run out of moves. She said regent. She did not sit. She stood inside the cell, and the guard closed the door behind her, and she let the silence sit there for a long count. Then she said, "I am not here to forgive you. I am here to tell you what you took." She told him about the first night in the pines. She told him about the second winter when she had nearly died of cold because she could not bring herself to cut the small wooden crib she had carried out into the forest in her arms. She told him about the 11 years she had hunted the wet nurse. She told him she had found the woman's grave and laid her hand on it, and asked the woman to forgive her for bringing strangers into the woman's last winter. She told him every small thing. He sat and listened with his face in his hands. When she was done, she said, "This is not a curse. This is only an account. You will go down into the silver pit, knowing what was on the other side of your choice. That is all I came to give you." He looked up at her at last. He said, "I know." She nodded. She turned. She left. She did not look back. She walked up the long stair of the mountain and out into the courtyard, and she sat on a stone bench in the sun until the bell rang at sundown for the lowering. She put her hands flat on the warm stone and she breathed. The bell rang once, twice, 3 times. After the third time, the sun went down behind the western ridge, and the pack was quiet. She got up and went inside and ate a plate of bread and broth in the small kitchen with 2 of the youngest maids, and she went to bed. She slept through the night without dreams. It was the first time in 24 years. She went home on the 11th day. Kale rode with her himself. 3 guards behind. No more. He had refused the procession the council wanted to give her. He had said, "My mother walked out of this mountain on bare feet. She will walk back in on her own time, and not in any cart they can stare at." They rode east for 2 days. The pines closed around them. The hut was exactly as she had left it 3 weeks before. The herb beds, the deer path, the chair on the porch. He stayed 3 nights. He chopped her winter wood himself, 24 years' worth of work in 3 days because he was a young king and could not sit still. He fixed the latch on the door. He pressed a small carved wolf into her palm on the last morning, a piece of black mountain stone, the only thing he had ever owned that had not been given to him by Vorin. He kissed her forehead. He climbed onto his horse. He rode east 1 slow circle around the hut so she could see him in the dawn. Then he turned and he rode back to the mountain. The mark on her wrist had not glowed since the throne hall. The moon thread had done its work. But every time the wind moved in the pines at night, Leora would put her hand over the place where the mark had been, and she would feel a small steady warmth there, and she would know her son was alive in the world and was thinking of her. She lived 11 more winters in that hut. She healed every woodcutter's child within 50 miles. She slept easy. She died one cold, clear morning with the carved black wolf in her hand and a cup of pine tea on the table beside her, and the king himself came east on a fast horse and carried her down the deer path on his own shoulders and buried her under the tallest pine, and that pine still stands. Pack children are taught the story now. They tell it the same way every time. They say it began with a fist on a marble floor and a mark that should not have lit. They say it ended with a king on his knees and a word he had never spoken before. They say the Omega who whispered, "I am not your mate, I am your mother," broke the pack in half because she told the truth in a room that had been built to bury it. And they say, every one of them, that the first thing the new king did the morning after he buried her was to walk out of the mountain at sunrise, alone, on bare feet, the way she had walked out 24 winters before. And the pines, they say, opened for him. And the pines, they say, remember her still.